Hello historians, and welcome to another Purple Shirt History. Today we'll be looking at how to compare sources in paper 2. I showed you how to look at a visual source and analyze it in the last video to answer message questions. Now we're going to look at two different sources and how you can compare and contrast them to answer the question. There's a lot of different types of questions that you compare sources in paper 2. Some will ask you, are you shocked? Are you surprised? Can one source prove that another source is lying? How similar, how different, and so on and so forth. So basically, it's the same type of question. You have to look at both sides and then come to a conclusion. So sit back, get your notebook, and I hope you enjoy the video. If you find it useful, please like, comment, and subscribe, and I look forward to hearing your feedback. It says, study sources D and E. How far do these two sources share the same view of American foreign policy? Explain your answer using details of the sources and your knowledge. So looking at the first source, it is a cartoon. Always want to read the provenance first. So the provenance is that little line of information underneath the source. It'll really tell you a lot. So from this provenance, we can say it is from Britain, so we know where it's from. We know the date, the 30th of June, 1950, and it explains to us the figure of the United Nations. It's got a machine gun, holding hands with President Truman of the U.S., leaping over the ghost of the League of Nations, which was the previous international organization in the interwar years that died due to a lack of military force. So looking at that, that is pretty pro-intervention in the Korean War. It's pretty obvious that there's a determined look on Truman's face and a determined look on the United Nations face. So it says history doesn't repeat itself. If there was no military intervention for South Korea, it was the United Nations would suffer the same fate as the League of Nations. So, okay, that's a pretty positive view on the intervention in South Korea in the Korean War. Now let's look at source D, the provenance. An announcement to the American people by President Truman on 27th of June, 1950. So this is slightly different. It's an American source. It's from the American president, not a British source. It's around the same time period, the beginning of the Korean War. And it is saying that in South Korea, the government forces were attacked by invading forces from North Korea. And this first paragraph is basically saying the Security Council of the United Nations is being pressed to defend South Korea. It was, I think, Resolution 84 was the number, and it gave the United Nations the authorization to use force in the Korean War. It was, looking at the bottom paragraph, the attack upon Korea made it plain that communism will now use armed invasion and war. It's saying that the U.S. will continue to uphold the rule of law. So looking at these two sources, do they agree with each other? Do they have the same view of foreign policy? I'm going to say, yeah, they do. So they're both positive. Why is this important to see? Well, first things first, they're from two Western sources, so they're probably going to be more pro-intervention than if one source was a U.S. source and one source was a Soviet source. If you're going to see a Soviet source or a North Korean source, it's going to be very negative towards the intervention in the Korean peninsula. So, yeah, okay, they agree to a large extent. So that would be our view of the foreign policy. Then, the details of the source. In picture sources, we saw, okay, there's different elements. So we said 1, 2, and 3. These three elements are showing unity between what needs to be done so it doesn't suffer, the UN doesn't suffer the same fate as the League of Nations. And then, of course, Truman's the man that is authorizing this. If he's saying it, of course, it's going to be pro-intervention in Korea. So to a large extent, these two show that foreign policy is warranted in terms of the U.S. getting involved through the United Nations in the Korean War.